On a warm Tuesday evening in the mid-1960s, the studio lights above the NBC stage burned with the kind of brightness that made every shadow disappear. The audience had arrived expecting laughter. They had dressed for a night of easy entertainment, the kind that let people forget their worries for an hour before returning to ordinary life. The band had already played its opening notes, the applause signs flashed on cue, and the familiar rhythm of late-night television settled over the room like a comfortable blanket. It was supposed to be another smooth broadcast, another night where jokes landed, stories flowed, and everyone went home smiling. At the center of that expectation sat a man who had built an entire career on making everything look effortless. Dean Martin leaned back on the couch with the relaxed posture that audiences had come to love. His suit was sharp but never stiff, his expression calm, his presence warm in a way that made people feel like they already knew him. To millions watching from their living rooms, he was the embodiment of charm. Someone who could turn any room into a friendly gathering with nothing more than a half-smile and a quiet joke delivered at just the right moment. The host across from him, Johnny Carson, understood that rhythm better than anyone. He had learned that television was not only about words, but about timing, tone, and the invisible thread that connected performer to audience. Carson had a talent for guiding conversations so gently that guests often forgot the cameras were even there. He knew when to push for humor, when to step back, and when to allow silence to carry more meaning than any punchline. That night he expected the same familiar dance, questions, laughter, maybe a song, and the comfortable glow of another successful show. But there was something slightly different in the air before the first real question was even asked. It wasn't obvious, not something anyone could point to directly. It was more like a faint shift beneath the surface, the kind that only becomes clear in hindsight. Dean Martin's smile was present, but quieter than usual. His eyes, though friendly, carried a softness that suggested fatigue rather than mischief. Anyone watching casually would have missed it entirely. Only those who had spent years around performers might have recognized the subtle weight behind the calm. Sitting beside him was someone the audience had not expected to see that night, a small figure with neatly combed hair and a posture that tried very hard to appear grown-up. Dean's young son sat close to his father, hands folded together as if he had been carefully reminded to behave. The audience reacted with immediate warmth when they noticed him. Children on television often brought out a softer energy in the room, a shared understanding that innocence had entered a space usually reserved for practiced personalities. Carson welcomed the boy kindly, his voice shifting into that gentle tone adults use when speaking to someone much younger. The moment drew smiles from the crowd. It felt wholesome, almost nostalgic, like a reminder that behind the bright lights and polished suits were real families and real lives continuing beyond the stage. For a few minutes, everything followed the expected path. Carson asked light questions. Dean responded with relaxed humor. The audience laughed in the familiar rhythm they had come to expect. Yet even within that comfort, there were tiny pauses, moments so brief they barely registered. Dean occasionally glanced toward his son, not with worry, but with the careful attention of a parent aware that children sometimes say things without understanding their impact. It was not fear, exactly. It was more like the quiet alertness of someone who has spent years managing what parts of himself the world is allowed to see. Dean Martin had long mastered the art of performance beyond the stage. His public persona was smooth, playful, almost untouchable. People believed they understood him because he appeared so consistent, always relaxed, always amused, always just a little removed from seriousness. That consistency was part of his brilliance. Audiences trusted what felt predictable. They found comfort in a personality that never seemed burdened. But anyone who has ever lived under constant expectation knows that consistency often requires effort no one else can see. Maintaining an image night after night, city after city, takes more than talent. It demands discipline, energy, and the willingness to keep showing up even when exhaustion quietly settles in the background. For performers of that era, men who came from modest beginnings and built careers through relentless work, stepping back was rarely an option they allowed themselves to consider. Carson, with his sharp observational instincts, sensed that subtle difference in Dean's demeanor. He didn't mention it. Professionals rarely do. Instead, he guided the conversation towards safer ground, recent projects, upcoming appearances, the kind of topics that kept the mood light. Dean responded smoothly, delivering lines with perfect timing. The audience laughed again. For a moment, the earlier feeling of quiet tension seemed to fade. Then Carson turned gently toward the young boy, smiling in that reassuring way that invited participation without pressure. He asked simple questions: what he liked to do, whether he enjoyed visiting the studio, whether he thought his father was funny at home. The audience leaned forward slightly, anticipating a cute or playful answer. These moments often produced the kind of spontaneous charm television producers loved. The child answered politely at first, his voice soft but clear. He looked occasionally at his father, as children often do when speaking in unfamiliar settings. There was admiration in that glance, but also something else, something thoughtful, as if he were carefully choosing words rather than speaking impulsively. It was the kind of seriousness that sometimes appears in children who spend a lot of time observing rather than interrupting. Dean kept his arm resting along the back of the couch behind him, close enough to signal comfort, distant enough to avoid drawing attention. His smile remained steady and practiced, yet his fingers shifted once against the fabric, an almost invisible movement that suggested he was listening more closely than before. Carson asked another gentle question, still light, still harmless on the surface. The audience expected laughter again. Instead, the boy paused. It wasn't a long pause, but it was enough to change the rhythm of the room. Silence on a live set carries a different weight than silence anywhere else. It stretches. It asks for attention. The child finally spoke, choosing words with careful honesty rather than performance. His voice held no intention of humor, no awareness that anything he said might carry deeper meaning. He simply answered as children often do, by describing what he had seen with his own eyes. For a fraction of a second, the studio atmosphere shifted in a way no script could have planned. The laughter that had been ready to rise never quite arrived. Carson's expression softened, attentive rather than playful. Dean's smile stayed in place, but the warmth behind it changed, becoming quieter, more reflective. No one in that room could have explained exactly why the moment felt different. Nothing dramatic had happened. No harsh words were spoken. Yet something honest had entered a space usually filled with carefully measured performance. And honesty, when it appears unexpectedly under bright lights, can feel far more powerful than any rehearsed line. Carson, ever the professional, nodded gently, acknowledging the boy's response without rushing past it. He understood instinctively that some moments deserve space rather than interruption. The audience, sensing the shift, remained unusually quiet. Even the band members behind their instruments sat still, watching. Dean Martin looked at his son, not with embarrassment but with a depth of attention that rarely appeared in public settings. For a brief instant, the distance between performer and person seemed to narrow. The polished image remained, but something more human flickered behind it, like a light briefly visible through a curtain. It was not a scandalous moment. It was not dramatic in the way headlines describe drama. It was simply real. And reality, when it surfaces in a place designed for entertainment, has a way of stopping everyone in their tracks. Carson cleared his throat softly, preparing to guide the conversation forward without dismissing what had just been said. The skill of a seasoned host is not to erase unexpected moments, but to carry them gently so the audience can breathe again. He offered a small, respectful smile, one that acknowledged the honesty in the room rather than trying to replace it with forced humor. Dean responded the way he always had when life edged too close to the surface. He leaned slightly forward, allowed a softer smile to form, and added a light remark, just enough to ease the tension without denying the truth that had briefly appeared. The audience, grateful for permission to relax, let out a quiet ripple of laughter. But something had already changed. For those few seconds, the performance had paused, and the human story underneath had quietly revealed itself. Not loudly, not painfully, but clearly enough that anyone paying attention could feel it. It was the kind of moment that doesn't interrupt a show, yet lingers long after the applause fades. The interview continued. Questions returned to safer territory. The rhythm of late-night television found its footing again. Yet beneath the polished conversation, there remained a subtle awareness that something genuine had passed through the room, something unscripted, unplanned, and impossible to fully capture on tape. Long after the broadcast ended, many who were present would struggle to describe exactly what they had felt. Nothing dramatic had occurred. No one had raised their voice. Still, there had been a brief glimpse of the quiet cost behind constant performance, the fatigue that can hide behind charm, the effort required to remain endlessly composed. Dean Martin finished the segment the same way he finished every appearance, with grace, humor, and the steady professionalism that had defined his career. The audience applauded warmly, the cameras shifted, the show moved forward. Yet somewhere beneath the applause, a different memory had already taken root, not of a joke or a song or a clever line, but of a small, honest voice cutting gently through the polished surface of show business. It was the kind of moment that doesn't make headlines, but it is the kind people remember. And though the lights would dim, the stage would clear, and another episode would replace it the next night, that brief pause, where performance gave way to truth, would remain with those who witnessed it like a quiet echo that refused to fade. When the final applause sign dimmed and the familiar closing music rolled across the studio, the audience rose with satisfied smiles, believing they had witnessed another charming evening of entertainment. From their perspective, nothing unusual had truly happened, just a sweet moment between a famous father and his young son, followed by a smooth return to jokes and light conversation. The cameras shut off, stagehands began moving equipment, and the bright energy that had filled the room slowly dissolved into the quieter, practical rhythm that always followed a live broadcast. Yet for those who remained on stage, the host, the guest, and the small boy sitting between two worlds, something unspoken lingered in the air like the echo of a note that refused to fully fade. Johnny Carson stood from his chair with the composed professionalism that had already begun to define his career, but the careful mask he wore for millions had loosened just enough for those nearby to notice. He adjusted his tie, nodded politely to the crew, and exchanged a few routine words, yet his voice carried a softness that suggested his thoughts were still somewhere else entirely. Carson had built his reputation on staying in control of any situation, guiding conversations with effortless precision, but moments earlier something had slipped past that control, a brief, honest glimpse that no amount of experience could have prepared him for. He was not shaken in a dramatic sense, yet there was a quiet weight in his posture, the kind that comes when a person realizes they have just witnessed something deeply human in a place designed to hide such things. Dean Martin remained seated for a few seconds longer than usual, as though allowing the room to clear before he moved. His son sat beside him, legs dangling slightly above the floor, unaware that anything significant had occurred. To the boy, it had simply been an evening on a brightly lit stage, surrounded by friendly faces and applause. Children rarely carry the burden of interpretation. They say what they see and trust the world to understand. Dean placed a gentle hand on the child's shoulder, not in correction, but in reassurance, a quiet signal that everything was fine. His expression remained calm, yet the ease that audiences associated with him had softened into something more reflective, as if the performance had taken more energy than usual. Backstage corridors always carried a different atmosphere than the stage itself. The bright illusion ended the moment one stepped beyond the curtain, replaced by narrow hallways, muted lighting, and the practical bustle of technicians finishing their work. That night, the hallway seemed unusually quiet. Crew members spoke in lower voices, not out of fear, but out of instinct, as if everyone had collectively sensed that the moment they had just witnessed deserved a kind of respectful silence. It was not discussed openly. Professionals in television understood that some things were best left unexamined in public, allowed to settle naturally without being turned into spectacle. Carson approached Dean near the dressing rooms with the gentle hesitation of someone choosing words carefully. He did not mention the exact exchange that had occurred on stage, nor did he attempt to analyze it. Instead, he offered a simple, sincere compliment about how composed Dean had been with his son beside him. The remark carried more meaning than its surface suggested. It was not praise for performance, but recognition of restraint. Dean responded with his usual understated humor, a quiet line delivered with a half-smile, yet the joke lacked the playful spark it might have carried earlier. It was not forced, but it was measured, as though he were conserving energy rather than spending it freely. For a moment the two men stood in comfortable silence, something rare in an environment built on constant dialogue. Carson understood, perhaps more clearly than most, the strange balance required to live both publicly and privately at the same time. Hosting a nightly show demanded presence, charm, and consistency regardless of personal fatigue. Watching Dean navigate that unexpected moment with his son had offered Carson a glimpse of a future he was only beginning to step into. A future where the line between persona and person would become increasingly difficult to maintain. He did not say this aloud. Some realizations are too personal to share in passing conversation, especially in a hallway where footsteps and distant voices echoed off the walls. Inside the dressing room, the atmosphere shifted again. Without the audience, without the cameras, the space felt smaller, more honest. Dean removed his jacket slowly and placed it over the back of a chair, movements deliberate rather than hurried. His son wandered toward a small table, fascinated by the simple objects scattered there: makeup kits, cue cards, a glass of water. Dean watched him with quiet attention, the kind that suggested he was absorbing something he rarely had time to notice during his relentless schedule. There was no anger in his expression, no embarrassment, only a thoughtful stillness that seemed to carry both pride and a faint trace of regret, the complicated mixture that often accompanies moments of unexpected truth. He crouched slightly so he could speak to the boy at eye level, asking if he had enjoyed being on stage. The child nodded eagerly, describing the lights and the applause with excitement. Dean listened without interruption, allowing the enthusiasm to unfold naturally. It was a small conversation, ordinary on the surface, yet it held a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the polished persona the public knew so well. For a brief stretch of time, there was no performer, no audience, no expectation. Only a father and his child sharing the simple aftermath of an unusual evening. Outside the room, Carson lingered longer than necessary before returning to his own office. He replayed the moment in his mind, not the exact words, but the feeling that had followed them. It was not discomfort that stayed with him, but recognition. He understood, perhaps more than he wanted to admit, how easily a life built around constant performance could quietly distance a person from the very relationships that gave that success meaning. The realization was not dramatic, yet it settled into him with the quiet persistence of a thought that would return again and again in the years ahead. Meanwhile, producers discussed routine matters, ratings expectations, upcoming guests, scheduling adjustments, as though the evening had unfolded exactly as planned. Television, by its nature, moves forward quickly. There's always another episode, another segment, another deadline waiting just beyond the present moment. Yet even within those practical conversations, there was a subtle awareness that something genuine had slipped through the carefully managed structure of the show. No one labeled it. No one analyzed it openly. Still, the memory lingered, carried silently by those who had witnessed it. Dean eventually stood, guiding his son toward the hallway with a gentle hand on his back. As they walked, the boy spoke freely about small details, the band, the laughter, the way the host had smiled at him. Dean responded with quiet encouragement, asking simple questions, allowing the child's excitement to fill the space. For a brief time, the distance created by long schedules and constant travel seemed to narrow. It was not a dramatic transformation, but a subtle shift, a reminder that presence does not always require grand gestures, only attention given in the moment it is needed. The studio, once alive with applause, now felt almost ordinary. Chairs were being stacked, cables coiled, lights dimmed one by one. The illusion of television had folded back into the everyday mechanics that made it possible. Yet for those who had been there, the memory of that small, honest exchange remained brighter than any spotlight. It was not remembered because it was shocking, but because it was sincere, and sincerity has a way of standing out in places built on performance. As Dean and his son stepped outside into the cooler night air, the noise of the city replaced the controlled environment of the studio. The boy looked up at his father, still talking, still animated by the adventure of the evening. Dean listened, his expression softer than it had been on stage, as though the quiet darkness allowed him to set aside the expectations that followed him under bright lights. For a moment, the world was reduced to a simple walk, a shared conversation, and the steady rhythm of footsteps on pavement. Inside, Carson finally sat alone at his desk, the studio now nearly empty. He leaned back, exhaled slowly, and allowed himself a rare pause between responsibilities. Hosting required constant forward motion, yet nights like this reminded him that not every meaningful moment arrives with applause or laughter. Some arrive quietly, disguised as ordinary conversation, leaving behind a realization that grows stronger with time. By the end of the evening, everything appeared normal again. The schedules would continue, the next show would be prepared, and audiences across the country would remember only another pleasant broadcast. Yet beneath that routine, a subtle understanding had taken root among those who had been closest to the moment, that behind every polished performance is a person carrying invisible weight, and that sometimes it takes the unfiltered honesty of a child to reveal it. No announcement marked the significance of what had happened. No headline captured it. Still, as the last lights in the studio were switched off, the memory remained, Not loud or dramatic, but steady, like a quiet truth that lingers long after the stage has gone dark. In the days that followed the broadcast, life around the studio moved forward with the familiar efficiency that defined the world of television. New guests were booked, scripts were revised, schedules adjusted, and the relentless rhythm of nightly production left little room for reflection. Yet for those who had been present that evening, the memory of that quiet, unexpected honesty lingered in subtle ways that were difficult to explain. It was not discussed openly in meetings or written into reports, but it surfaced in passing glances, in pauses during casual conversations, in the unspoken understanding that sometimes the smallest moments reveal the deepest truths. Dean Martin returned to his routine almost immediately, because routine was the only way a career of that magnitude could function. His days were filled with rehearsals, recording sessions, travel plans, and endless commitments that required his presence not just physically, but emotionally. Every performance demanded that he step into the familiar role audiences adored, the relaxed entertainer who seemed untouched by pressure. He wore that role with the ease of long practice, yet beneath that ease there existed a quiet fatigue that rarely showed itself in public. The expectations placed upon him were not loud or aggressive. They were steady, constant, and unyielding, like a tide that never fully receded. Those who worked closely with him noticed the difference between the man who stood under the spotlight and the one who sat quietly in dressing rooms between appearances. On stage, he moved with effortless confidence, delivering lines with perfect timing and allowing laughter to rise naturally around him. Off stage, there were moments when he seemed to withdraw into stillness, conserving energy in a way that suggested each performance required more from him than anyone outside that inner circle could see. It was not sadness, exactly, but the kind of deep tiredness that comes from giving the same part of yourself away night after night without pause. At home, the contrast between public image and private life became even more pronounced. The house was comfortable, filled with the signs of success that most people only dreamed of, yet comfort does not always equal presence. There were evenings when Dean arrived late, the quiet of the house already settled in, the children either asleep or finishing homework in another room. He would loosen his tie, move through the familiar spaces, and carry with him the lingering silence that often follows long hours of performance. It was not that he did not care. Rather, it was that so much of his energy had already been spent before he ever crossed the front door. His young son, still at an age where time is measured not by schedules, but by moments shared, watched these patterns with the straightforward perception children naturally possess. He did not interpret them with resentment or judgment. He simply noticed. Children rarely analyze absence in complex terms. They understand presence and the lack of it. They remember the evenings when laughter fills a room, and they also remember the nights when doors close early and voices grow quiet. That simple awareness carries a truth adults often spend years learning to articulate. Dean, for his part, was not unaware of this distance. There were nights when he would sit alone after the house had grown still, the noise of the day finally fading, and feel the weight of the roles he carried: provider, performer, public figure, father. None of those roles conflicted on the surface, yet balancing them required more than effort. It required time, and time was the one resource his career consumed without hesitation. The success he had worked so hard to achieve had created opportunities beyond anything he might once have imagined. Yet it had also built a structure around his life that was difficult to step outside of without affecting countless other people who depended on that momentum. Meanwhile, Johnny Carson found himself reflecting on that night more often than he expected. Hosting demanded focus on the present, yet certain moments refused to stay confined to memory. He began to recognize how easily a life shaped around constant performance could gradually reshape personal priorities without conscious intention. Each show required preparation, presence, and the emotional energy to connect with millions of viewers who would never meet him in person. The applause, though distant through the television screen, still carried an invisible expectation that he would return the next night with the same consistency. Carson understood that the audience's connection to a performer is built on reliability. They tune in expecting familiarity, a personality that feels steady even when their own lives are unpredictable. That reliability, however, requires a kind of emotional discipline that few people outside the industry fully grasp. Watching Dean navigate that unexpected moment with his son had revealed how thin the line could become between maintaining that reliability and losing the space needed to simply exist as oneself. Weeks passed, and the incident gradually faded from public awareness, replaced by new broadcasts, new headlines, new entertainment cycles. Yet within the quieter spaces of memory, it remained vivid. For some, it became a reminder of the humanity behind celebrity. For others, it was simply an unusual moment that had briefly disrupted the expected flow of a show. For Dean himself, it settled into the background of many similar moments, small reminders that success carries costs not always visible from the outside. There were times during performances when he would glance toward the audience and notice families sitting together, parents leaning toward their children, sharing laughter in real time. Those glimpses were fleeting, easily dismissed as part of the general crowd, yet occasionally they lingered long enough to stir a quiet reflection. The applause that followed his songs was genuine and appreciative, but applause, by its nature, is momentary. It rises quickly and fades just as fast, leaving behind a silence that only the performer hears when the lights dim. At home, on rarer evenings when schedules aligned and the house was filled with shared conversation, there existed a different kind of warmth, one not fueled by expectation, but by simple presence. Those moments did not come with bright lights or standing ovations, yet they carried a depth that performance could never replicate. Dean experienced them fully when they appeared, though he also recognized how easily they could be postponed by another obligation, another commitment that seemed impossible to refuse. Over time, the awareness of that balance, between the world that celebrated him and the one that quietly waited for him, grew more pronounced. It was not accompanied by dramatic decisions or sudden changes, but by a gradual understanding that success is rarely a single achievement. Instead, it is a continuous exchange, a trade between what is given to the public and what remains for the private self. That exchange is rarely measured in obvious ways. It is felt in missed conversations, in evenings shortened by exhaustion, in the quiet recognition that some opportunities, once passed, do not return. For Carson, the lesson unfolded differently but with similar depth. He began to pay closer attention during interviews, allowing more space for genuine responses rather than steering every exchange toward humor. The audience still laughed, the show still entertained, yet there were moments when sincerity slipped through more naturally. Viewers might not have noticed the shift consciously, but they responded to it all the same. Authenticity, even in small doses, has a way of strengthening connection rather than weakening it. As months turned into years, the memory of that evening became less about a specific conversation and more about what it represented. A reminder that behind every polished image exists a person navigating the same fundamental needs as anyone else. Recognition, rest, connection, purpose. These are not replaced by fame. They are simply hidden behind it. For those who live under constant visibility, the challenge is not achieving success, but maintaining the parts of life that success cannot provide. Dean continued to perform with the same professionalism that had defined his career, delivering music and laughter to audiences who adored him. Yet within that consistency, there were subtle shifts, moments when he lingered a little longer after shows, moments when he chose quieter gatherings over crowded celebrations, moments when the persona softened just enough for those closest to him to notice. None of these changes were dramatic, but they suggested a growing awareness that presence, once lost, is difficult to reclaim. The night on the studio stage had not altered his life overnight, nor had it created headlines or public discussion. Its impact was quieter, more personal, unfolding over time in the form of reflection rather than reaction. Sometimes the most significant moments do not announce themselves as turning points. They simply plant a thought that continues to grow long after the event itself has passed. And so the weight that followed the applause was not heavy in a visible way. It did not interrupt performances or alter schedules. Instead, it existed as a steady awareness carried beneath the surface, a recognition that the smiles shared with millions and the silence shared with family were part of the same life, each requiring attention, each deserving space. For a man who had mastered the art of appearing effortless, that awareness became both a quiet burden and a quiet guide, shaping choices in ways no audience could ever fully see. Years have a way of smoothing the sharp edges of memory, yet certain moments refuse to fade no matter how much time passes. For Dean Martin, the memory of that quiet exchange on a brightly lit stage did not haunt him in a dramatic or painful way, but it lingered like a soft echo that returned in unexpected places. It would surface during long flights between cities, in the stillness of hotel rooms after applause had ended, or in the brief silence that follows the final note of a song when the audience has not yet begun to clap. These were the spaces where performance could no longer fill the air, where a man who had spent his life mastering charm was left alone with thoughts that required no audience. Success continued to follow him, steady and unwavering as it had for years. Concert halls filled, television appearances drew viewers, and his voice remained as recognizable as ever. To the public, very little appeared to change. He still carried the relaxed confidence people admired, still delivered humor with effortless timing, still seemed untouched by the pressures that shaped the lives of most entertainers. Yet beneath that steady exterior, his understanding of what those moments truly cost had deepened. Not in a way that bred regret, but in a way that encouraged reflection. He began to recognize that the persona he wore so comfortably had been built not only from talent, but from discipline, sacrifice, and a quiet willingness to place the needs of millions above the needs of a few. At home, time moved differently. Children grow without waiting for schedules to clear, and relationships evolve whether or not anyone is ready for the change. Dean noticed how quickly small hands that once needed guidance became independent, how conversations that were once simple turned thoughtful, how presence, when offered, carried more meaning than any gift success could provide. He was not a man given to grand emotional speeches, yet there were moments when he lingered longer in shared rooms, listening rather than performing, allowing silence to exist without the need to fill it with jokes. Those moments did not erase the years shaped by distance, but they created new memories that rested beside the old ones, softer and more grounded. Johnny Carson, moving deeper into his own legacy as a host, carried his own version of that awareness. Over time, he developed a reputation not only for wit, but for the rare ability to let sincerity breathe during an interview. Viewers trusted him because he seemed willing at times to set aside performance and simply listen. The entertainment world rarely rewards stillness, yet Carson learned that stillness, used carefully, could reveal more about a guest than any clever question. Though he never publicly framed that shift around a single night or a single conversation, those who worked closely with him understood that certain experiences shape instincts in ways no training ever could. As the years passed, the world of entertainment itself began to change. Audiences grew more interested in authenticity, in glimpses of the real lives behind public images. The distance between performer and viewer, once carefully maintained, became slightly more transparent. Stories of exhaustion, pressure, and the human cost of constant visibility slowly entered public conversation. What had once been considered private burdens became topics people could acknowledge without discomfort. In that changing atmosphere, moments like the one that had occurred on that quiet evening no longer seemed out of place. They seemed inevitable, reminders that every public figure is also a private person navigating the same fragile balance as anyone else. Dean Martin aged with the same understated grace that had defined his career. He did not chase attention or attempt to reinvent himself dramatically. Instead, he moved through later years with a quieter presence, choosing appearances carefully and valuing environments that allowed him to remain composed without effort. Those who met him during that period often remarked on a calm warmth that felt less like performance and more like genuine ease. It was as if the distance between the persona and the person had gradually narrowed, not through a sudden decision, but through the natural passage of time and experience. There were evenings when he would sit after a performance, the noise of the venue fading behind him, and reflect not on the applause, but on the simple fact that another night had been shared with strangers who found comfort in his voice. He understood that entertainment, at its best, is not about illusion but about connection, about giving people a brief escape, a moment of relief from their own burdens. That understanding allowed him to view his career not as a machine that demanded endless output, but as a craft that had, in its own way, brought joy to countless lives. Yet alongside that pride existed a quieter appreciation for the moments that required no audience at all. The conversations at a dinner table, the laughter heard without microphones, the presence of family that asked for nothing more than time. The memory of his son's childhood honesty remained part of that reflection, not as a wound, but as a reminder. Children speak without filters, and in doing so they often reveal truths adults spend years trying to phrase carefully. That night had not exposed failure. It had simply illuminated the invisible cost of living in two worlds at once. Over time, Dean came to see it less as an uncomfortable moment and more as a gift an unexpected pause that had allowed him to glimpse how his life appeared through the eyes of someone who loved him without expectation. Johnny Carson, nearing the later chapters of his own remarkable journey, carried a similar recognition. Hosting had given him influence, admiration, and a place in cultural history, yet it had also required relentless consistency. In rare interviews, he spoke about the challenge of separating the public figure from the private self, about the importance of finding spaces where performance could be set aside. Those reflections were never framed as regrets. They were acknowledgments that success is rarely simple, and that the qualities that build a career can sometimes complicate a life. As the decades moved forward, the world continued to celebrate both men for the joy they had brought to audiences. Clips of performances were replayed, stories retold, legacies honored. Viewers remembered the laughter, the music, the effortless charm that had once filled living rooms across the country. Few remembered the quiet moments behind those performances, the pauses that revealed the humanity beneath the polish. Yet those quieter memories often carry the deepest meaning, even if they remain known only to those who experienced them firsthand. In the end, the significance of that long-ago evening was not found in shock or spectacle, but in its simplicity. A child had spoken with honesty. Two seasoned professionals had recognized the truth within those words. For a brief moment, the curtain between performance and reality had lifted just enough to reveal that behind every celebrated figure stands a person balancing responsibility, exhaustion, love, and hope. That glimpse did not diminish the magic of entertainment. It enriched it, reminding everyone present that the ability to bring joy to others often requires strength few people ever see. When the curtain finally falls on any career, what remains is rarely the number of shows performed or the applause once received. What remains are the connections formed, the lives touched, the quiet understandings gained along the way. Dean Martin's legacy was never limited to his voice or his humor. It was also shaped by the quiet lessons hidden within moments like that one. Lessons about presence, about balance, about the importance of being seen not only as a performer, but as a human being capable of both strength and vulnerability. And so the story does not end with silence or regret, but with a quieter kind of wisdom. The lights dim, the audience goes home, and the stage returns to darkness, yet the truth that briefly appeared under those bright studio lamps continues to matter. It reminds us that success is most meaningful when it does not erase the simple connections that give life its warmth. It reminds us that behind every smile offered to the world is a person who also needs rest, understanding, and time with those who know them beyond applause. Most of all, it reminds us that sometimes the most powerful moments are not the ones designed to entertain, but the ones that reveal, gently and without intention, what it truly means to live a life shared between the public stage and the quiet rooms called home.